Hello and welcome to a Talmud Israeli production. Today we'll review the highlights of this week's course of Daf Yomi study, Masechet Yevamot, pages 20 through 26, Chaf through Chaf Vav. Chaf. Klal Amru Yevama. A general rule was stated regarding the laws of Yevama, of levirate marriage. Kol shei Isur Erva, whatever potential Yibum relationship already exists as a prohibition on account of erva, of an incestuous relationship, then in that case, if these two people are aligned with each other in potential ibum, there shall be no ibum done, and no chalitza needs to be done. Rather, the yevama, the woman, the widow, is allowed to marry anyone she wants at that point. Isur mitzvah, Isur kedusha. However, if the prohibition of this union, of this potential yavam and yavama, only rises to the level of Isur mitzvah, which we'll see as a rabbinical prohibition, or an Isur kedusha, which we'll see is probably a kohanic prohibition or something related to sanctity, then choletzet lo mebemet. She'll do chalitza, but there cannot be any yibum. So, Isur mitzvah, what is the definition of Isur mitzvah? Shnyobi divrei sofrim, secondary prohibited incestuous relations by rabbinical decree. Isur Kedusha, what is it? A prohibition of sanctity. Almana l'kohen gadol, the example is a widow marrying a high priest. Grusha v'chlutza l'kohen edot, or a divorcee or a woman who had chalitza done to her marrying a regular kohen, or a mamzer marrying a regular Yisrael, or a mamzeret marrying a regular Yisrael. So these are categories where there is a law, Torah law of sanctity that prohibits this union. In those cases, there shall be chalitza, but there shall be no yibum. Chaf Aleph. Kol sheben keva erva. In any situation where there would have been, if this were a female, it would have been an erva relationship, then if it's a male, bezachar, gaz valishta b'shum shniya, then the wife of that male has the status of secondary prohibition. Midirabanan, isur shniyot b'divrei sofrim. So, in order to understand how we define and how we get to those categories which are isur shniyot b'divrei sofrim, whatever would have been midoraita in the case of a woman, in the case of a man, his wife is shniyot. Okay. Chaf bet. Gesh nitgayer katan shnolad dami. A convert to Judaism who converts to Judaism is like treated as though they're a brand new baby, like a child, in the sense that they have no familial attachments, no relationships. Rather, they're on their own. They're their own person. Erva gufa, ilav shalayomru bain mi kedusha chamur kedusha kala lagazu burabanan. And the rule is that under Torah law, all the incestuous relations, the erva laws, do not apply to this ger. However, by rabbinical decree, they do apply, lest people say that this person who went from being an idolater, a heathen, to being a Jew, went from being a more severe type of sanctity, that there are prohibitions on the immoral, to now a lower level of sanctity, and there are no prohibitions on the immoral. And the last thing we want is for anyone to think that Judaism represents a lower level of morality. And so, by rabbinical decree, all the usual erva relationships are forbidden to the ger. Chaf Gimel. If a man betroths one of two sisters, but he doesn't know which one. He's uncertain of the identity of the girl he betrothed, one of two possible sisters. Now, he has to divorce both of them with a get to each one, because each one could be the sister of his actual wife, and thus a prohibited relation. And so a divorce must be given to both. What happens if he died before having the opportunity to divorce them? And he only had one brother. This one brother must give chalitza to both of these women. He can't do yibum to either of them because of the possibility that it's the wrong one. So he'll do chalitza to both of them. If he had two brothers, then it's possible and it's encouraged for one of them to do chalitza and one of them to do yibum, because then there's no possibility of sin. Chaf Daled. Mitzvah begadol liabein. When there are many brothers available to do yibum, preferably the mitzvah, the ideal form of the mitzvah, is for the oldest brother to do the yibum. However, if a younger brother jumped the gun and performed the act of yibum with the widow prior to any of the older brothers having an opportunity, what's done is done, and they are married. Tanu Rabbanan, how do we know that preferably the mitzvah is done by the gadol, the oldest brother? Because the Torah says ha-bechor, the firstborn. So the reference to the firstborn teaches you that ideally that's the person who does the mitzvah. Chafei. Hamotzi et ishto mishum shem ra, lo yachazir. Mishum neder, lo yachazir. If a person were to divorce his wife because of shame ra, because of a bad name, a bad reputation, some accusation that was leveled against her, unproven but an accusation, he should not remarry her. Why? Because people will think that, in fact, the original divorce was based upon false pretenses, and if there were any children that were born in a second marriage, which turns out to have not been a marriage, then there will be mamzerim. Similarly, mishum neder lo if she took a vow and now he divorced her because of that vow, but there was a release from the vow, it could be argued that the divorce was under false pretenses and not a divorce, and therefore there's the prospect of having mamzerim produced from another union that she engaged in afterward, which was never really a marriage. Okay, Chaf Vav. So the Mishnah had listed a whole bunch of categories of men who shall not marry a woman whom they facilitated being matrimonially available. Meaning, a chacham, a sage, who, by virtue of his decree of not releasing a vow, caused a woman to get divorced, and now she's available, he shouldn't marry her. Or a person brings a get from one country to another and says it's a kosher get and was signed in front of me and sealed in front of me. So he caused her to be available, he shouldn't marry her. Or a person testifies about the availability of a woman in marriage. He shouldn't marry her because in all these cases we suspect that they're lying or that they're doing something wrong, and whatever they did was only to have access to this woman. So the Mishnah says, in all these cases, if they, at the time that they did their action, they were already married to someone else, and their wife died after the fact, and only now are they personally available, then it's perfectly permissible for these men to marry the women whom they made available for marriage, because we don't suspect anything was done wrong. Everyone have a great week.